The useState hook is quite useful when we have simple state management. But if your state updates require complex state logic to be executed, or if the next state depends upon the previous state, then the useReducer hook is a better way of managing state. The useReducer hook returns a state and a dispatch function for it, which allows you to dispatch actions to your to modify the state of your application. The modification itself is managed using a reducer function which receives a state and an action as the two parameters, and then can use the action to decide on how to update the state. Those of you who are familiar with Redux would notice that this is similar to the way Redux implements state management. Going back to our to-do application, let me go ahead and update the useToDo's custom hook to make use of the useReducer instead of the useState. To do that, let's go ahead and add a new file to the state folder called as actiontypes.js. As I said, those familiar with Redux will notice that this is similar to the way we typically structure Redux state management. So we'll export constant add to do equal to add to do. So we are just defining some string constants here. Let me go ahead and define a couple of more string constants like this. So we'll define two more. The second one is toggle to do, which we define as toggle to do, and then, as you would expect, the third one would be delete to do. Now, you don't have to do it this way. You can simply directly use the constants strings within your reducer, but this makes it more easier to organize and structure your code. Now, once we have defined these constants, let's go to the to-dos folder and then import all the action types that we have just defined from the action types file here. And then let's go ahead and define a function called reducer, which receives the state and action as the two parameters. And we will use a switch function here with action.type to switch across that, and the three cases: action types dot add to do. We'll define what goes in there in a minute. Action types dot toggle to do, and the delete to do, and of course the default, which will simply return the state. Now, for the add to do, we can simply go ahead and cut out this part from here, from the set to dos here, and then add it into the add to dos, and then return. We'll call this as state here because the state is the first parameter, and so we will return that from the add to do here. So we are basically concatenating what we receive as the value in the action there. So the ID will be defined as date. Now the title will be defined as action payload. We'll see why we define it that way. So those of you familiar with Redux will see how we define these functions like this. Then we will take the second part from the toggle to do and then cut that out from there and then bring it in to the toggle to do here and then modify it. And this would be state.map. So we will return state.map to do, and to do ID is action payload. Then the third part, the delete to do, we'll simply cut this out from here and bring it into the delete to do here and say return state filter to do ID is equal to action dot payload. And so now our reducer function is ready. When it receives an add to do action, then it is going to concatenate what comes in the payload and prepare a to do item and then concatenate it into the state and return the state there. Then if it is a modification, the toggling, then it toggles the to do completed here based on the ID of the to do item. So we just search through that and then modify that and then return the modified version here. And then if it is to delete the item, so we just filter out the item from the state and then return the filtered array from here. And in your use to dos, instead of using use state, we will use useReducer here, and the useReducer will return to dos and a dispatch function here. And in the useReducer, we are going to use the reducer that we have just implemented, and then we will have to initialize the initial state of the to-dos, which is going to be an empty array. And then in addition, since we are using the useReducer here, we should be importing the useReducer, which Visual Studio has already done for us. We no longer need the use state, so I'm going to remove it from the import here. And now for each of these three modifications, we're going to dispatch the action to our reducer function here. So we're going to use the dispatch for all these three here. So let me go ahead and modify that. And instead of set to dos, now this dispatch function will receive an object here. For each of them, the object contains the type, which is action types add to do in this case, and then the payload is the to-do title for the add to do here. Similarly, for the toggle to do, the type is action toggle to do. Now you see why I have defined the action types in a separate file there. It makes it more easy to write the code, and the payload correspondingly is the to-do ID, and for the delete, the type is action types delete to do, and the payload is the to-do ID here. That's it. With this, we have updated our useToDo's custom hook to use the useReducer in place of the useState. And in order to make use of the useReducer, we need to implement the reducer function here, which we have just implemented up here. And also we defined the action types in the actiontypes.js file and then imported it there. And then we have modified the 3 functions here to dispatch the actions with the corresponding payload to the reducer here. I realize that in the reducer function definition, I no longer need these breaks because we are returning the values right there. So I don't need these breaks anyway. So let me remove them and save the changes. And then let's go ahead and take a look at the modified application in the browser. Going to the browser, you now notice that the modified application works exactly the same as before, except that now this application is making use of the useReducer hook instead of the useState hook. We have just seen how we can make use of the useReducer hook in situations where the updating of the state requires complex logic or where the next state depends upon the previous state, as shown in this simple example. Now, this is an easy way of managing state within your application. Now, this doesn't mean that Redux is no longer required. It just means that in situations where you require complex state management, the useReducer hooks allows you to implement something like that. Redux does have its own use case, and there are situations where a full Redux-based state management is more appropriate. But in many applications that require a reasonable way of managing state, the useReducer hook can answer your requirements very easily.